Welcome to World Affairs Today, brought to you by the World Affairs Council, Washington, D.C., a leading forum for global education and international affairs.
Good evening. My name is Stephanie Fassler, and I'm the International Affairs Director for the World Affairs Council, Washington, D.C. On behalf of the Council, I welcome you to this author series and World Affairs Today program. In September 2001, the international jihadist group Al-Qaeda became a household name after their devastating terrorist attack on U.S. soil. While they had been active in the previous decade, supporting and organizing terrorist attacks around the world, it was this act that drew the United States into a decade-long war in Afghanistan and later Iraq. The death of the group's leader in 2011 led some to believe that Al-Qaeda was in decline. Since then, other jihadist groups such as Boko Haram and the Islamic State of Iraq and the Levant have grabbed the headlines. But is Al-Qaeda gone? As are the threats that it poses. Daniel Byman, author of Al-Qaeda, the Islamic State, and the Global Jihadist Movement, What Everyone Needs to Know, will help us answer this question. He also seeks to clarify some of the common misconceptions and the assumed knowledge about Al-Qaeda and modern jihadi groups. Daniel Byman is currently a professor at Georgetown University's Security Studies program and the Edmund A. Walsh School of Foreign Service. He is also the director of Brookings Institution's Director of Research, and a senior fellow in the Center for Middle East Policy. Previously, Mr. Byman was an adjunct professor and research director at RAND Corporation and is a member of the International Institute for Counterterrorism. He was a staff member on the 9/11 Commission and the Joint 9/11 Inquiry staff of the House and Senate Intelligence Committees. His work has been published in International Security and Political Science Quarterly, and he is the author of several books, including The Five-Front War, The Better Way to Fight Global Jihad. Please join me in welcoming Mr. Byman.
Thank you, Stephanie, and thank you everyone here for coming out to a World Affairs Council event, especially on debate night. Right, because I actually intend to fortify myself quite heavily before watching, and I think some of you are missing valuable time. The title of my book, the subtitle is What Everyone Needs to Know, which is an Oxford series. It's, in my view, certainly a portentous and perhaps even pretentious subtitle. When my family was discussing, we were trying to discuss if my dog wrote a book, what would he say everyone needs to know? And I think he'd have chapters on, how to rub his belly properly and other important issues. So I hope the kind of grandiose nature of the title doesn't turn you off. The purpose of the book really is to explain the evolution of both this broader jihadist movement, including Al-Qaeda, including the Islamic State, and also American counterterrorism. Now, Stephanie mentioned 9/11 as a starting point for many Americans. And if you think about that, really within a week, there was a certain degree of clarity, as strange as that sounds. For the most part, we knew who did it, right? That was almost immediately clear. We also knew the course of the American response, the invasion of Afghanistan, and a global manhunt for the Al-Qaeda operatives. Let's fast forward to another September 11th, which is in 2012, when Ambassador Stevens was killed in Benghazi along with 3 other Americans. Just a few things about that. It was done by a group called Ansari Sharia, or suspected at least, and they are not linked to Ansari Sharia in Yemen, another jihadist group. It was praised by Ayman Zawahiri, who is leading Al-Qaeda, but it may have been more influenced by Al-Qaeda of the Arabian Peninsula, but also Al-Qaeda of the Islamic Maghreb. In that area, however, we later on would see the Islamic State take some presence. The reason I'm rattling off all these names is not to inform anyone here about the extremely contentious Benghazi attack, but really to illustrate, I hope, the complexity of this movement today. That there are all these different strands, some linked to Al-Qaeda, there's an Islamic State strand, some are independent, and what I'm trying to say in my book is that this movement is exceptionally complex. And as a result, we have to think of the threat in a much more nuanced way. I think tonight at the debate, you'll hear that we're all going to die very soon. I don't believe that. I think the threat is real, but actually somewhat limited. At the same time, we have to think about counterterrorism in a more nuanced way. I think that a lot of the tools that actually worked rather well against Al-Qaeda are not going to work particularly well today. So today I'll talk about the movement a bit, some of its strengths and weaknesses. Then I want to talk about the purpose of terrorism, which to me, I think most people think is obvious, but to me is actually not for many of these groups, and I think we've often got it wrong. Then I'll talk a little bit about the Islamic State, and then a few thoughts on counterterrorism. One of my chapters is called What Do We Talk About When We Talk About Al-Qaeda? Right? And in this chapter, I get to some of the issues, which is we use this term very loosely. And I think I could argue here plausibly to all of you that the Al-Qaeda core is somewhere between a couple, high dozens and low hundreds of individuals today. That this is a small organization, and it's an organization on the run. But you can go out a circle and look at the people whom they've trained, right, who have gone through Al-Qaeda training camps, who they've had some influence over. And here we're getting, well over 10,000. Then you could go out another circle and talk about other jihadist groups, especially ones that have pledged a certain degree of allegiance to Al-Qaeda, and now we're seeing it to the Islamic State. And there we're talking hundreds of thousands, right? These are large insurgent organizations. And then you could talk about the outermost circle of individuals who have some degree of sympathy to some aspects of what these organizations want to accomplish. And here you're talking hundreds of thousands, if not millions, right? And so when we talk about this organization, people often conflate these different levels. There's good and bad news. The bad news is the problem in some ways is quite large. The good news is as you go out, as you get bigger and bigger, the problem becomes much less about the United States, much less about the West, and is much more varied. So the problem is big, but it's not always directed where we think. Historically, why has this been a group of such concern, focusing first on the Al-Qaeda core? I mentioned this is a relatively small group. This is something most people miss, right? This is an organization that tried to choose the best. They tried to find people who were highly committed and also who were highly trained and frankly who played nice in the sandbox. Right? This is going to not surprise anyone here, but many of these violent organizations attract people who are asocial, who are homicidal, who you really don't want fighting next to you. And they deliberately chose people who, frankly, you do want fighting next to you if that's what you believe. These are people who had proven themselves as warriors and also who had proven themselves to some degree as team players. So it meant that they were an organization that could sustain losses, right? And this is a huge question when you study any terrorist group, which is after they do an attack, they're going to take some losses. Some people killed, some people might desert, others will be arrested. What happens next? And the vast majority of groups, the answer is they go out of business, right? But Al-Qaeda was founded in 1988, right? So it's approaching its 30th anniversary, right? That's an amazing accomplishment for a terrorist group that's been hunted around the world. It's also a group that learned a lot about operational security. Okay, and this is more of an intelligence term of art, but are they able to keep their personnel and operations secret? Now, they fail at this on a daily basis, okay, so I don't want to exaggerate this. But at the same time, they're an organization where if you look at their material from the start, they talk about some very important questions. How do you operate when the world's intelligence and police services are trying to find you? Right? So how do you set up a safe house? How do you communicate? And these questions are really difficult ones, again, that most groups learn too late. So it's an organization that knows how to survive as an organization. It's also an organization that has an agenda that's quite broad. Right? So it has embraced causes such as being, of course, against what it would see as the hostile U.S. presence in the Middle East. It's against the Israeli presence in the Middle East. It has pushed the idea that there are an array of regimes in the Arab world in particular that are illegitimate. And many of these causes have wide support. And it's been able to attach its name to many of these causes over time. And a big one, which I'll discuss in a little bit, is what the Islamic State has done, which is it's attached itself to sectarianism, to the idea that there are good Muslims and bad Muslims, and Shia Muslims in this case, but as well as several other Muslim minorities are bad. And that's proven exceptionally popular, right? It's a narrative that many people embrace. But to understand much of the success of this movement, you have to understand two failures, right? One failure is the failure of alternatives in the Middle East, right? So if you look at the Middle East, where are the good governments, right? Or I'm talking specifically about the Arab world, right? Is there a government that, frankly, you all would want to live under, right? And I'm guessing the answer is no. And so you had different periods where you had different dreams. You had a period of Arab nationalism. You had dreams of socialism. You have the modernizing military leader. You have the monarch who showers riches on his people. And in places like Pakistan, you have a democracy that is remarkably corrupt and inefficient. Right? So you have alternatives, but they're all pretty bad. So if you are a young person in this area especially, you are casting about for other ways of politics. Right? There's been a fundamental failure of politics. A second failure is more immediate and something we've seen dramatically in recent years, which is state failure or state collapse. Right? Where when I first began studying the Middle East, you're going to laugh when I say this, the problem was the region was too stable. Right? And we always think of the Middle East as almost a synonym for instability, but for many years it really wasn't true. You had these leaders, right, in Syria and Iraq and Jordan and Tunisia and Morocco that just kind of lived forever, right? And you could take snapshots in 5-year periods and you'd have the same names, right? And, the joy was I could go on vacation for a month and come back and there wasn't much change, right? And then we have this period, that began quite hopefully in 2011 of rapid instability, right? Where you have leaders changing at a rapid level, but then you start to see states collapsing. And this is a real shift in the evolution of the jihadist movement. Historically, if you look at Al-Qaeda, it was protected until 9/11 by sympathetic regimes. So it had bases in Sudan and then Afghanistan, and when we say Afghanistan, we should also say Pakistan. So it had bases in Afghanistan, Pakistan, and Sudan, and had the support of governments there. Right? After 9/11, this all changes, and it becomes much more about, are there places where they have the opportunity to operate? So ungoverned space in Iraq after the U.S. invasion, in Yemen, the Islamic State, of course, takes advantage of, grows out of the Syrian civil war. If a group is operating in a strong state, so in Saudi Arabia, in Jordan, in Morocco, it is usually crushed or greatly reduced in power. Right? So the strength of the state is I would say, as a professor, I would say is a key variable. Right, that if you have a strong state, you're going to see a lot less of a problem. Not no problem, but less of a problem. However, it's important to know that these jihadist groups have never been the prime movers when it comes to state collapse. They're not the ones causing the state to collapse. What's happening is the state is collapsing, and they're like a parasite engorging themselves on the state collapse. Often it starts out, Syria is a good example. Syria, it started out as peaceful protest. Then it became kind of violent protest. Then it became, we're seeing some limited guerrilla activity, then more guerrilla activity. But all of that was not really jihadist, right? I remember tracking this. And we would say, well, there's no kind of jihadist Al-Qaeda presence. Well, a few are showing up, but they're not really organized. More are showing up, but they're not really forming their own groups. More are showing up, but they're forming their own groups. But these groups aren't particularly important. More are showing up, they're forming their own groups. These groups are important. More are showing up, they're forming their own groups. These groups are the dominant groups, right? So we saw a steady progression, and that's actually quite common, where over time the conflict radicalizes people and the moderate groups tend to get wiped out. All that said, many of the group's strengths and how it's been able to operate are also weaknesses or contain their own set of problems. Let's start with the broad agenda. I said they have this broad agenda, so it embraces the anti-Israel struggle, the anti-U.S. struggle, bad regimes. One problem with that is that when you're everyone's enemy, you're everyone's enemy, right? So the people who hate Al-Qaeda, the people who hate the Islamic State, well, it's a pretty long list, right? So you can add not only the United States and Western Europe, you could add almost every Arab regime, you could add Russia, you could add China. There's not much that brings all these countries together, but this does, right? So they create a huge enemies list by giving themselves the ability to attract recruits. Also, they lose their priorities. Right? What are many of these groups about? If the answer is everything, they're really about nothing. Right? If they're fighting everywhere, we can give some grandiose thing. They're trying to establish a caliphate throughout the Middle East, right? If they're fighting everywhere, they're probably going to succeed nowhere. And if you look at terrorist groups that have succeeded, groups like Hamas, groups like Hezbollah, right? That, Hamas is the government of Gaza right now, right? It's a huge success. It's because it's been focused and it has embedded itself in deep social ties with the local population. The Islamic State, I think, is a bit of a different beast on this, and I'll come back to that near the end. But historically, Al-Qaeda has not been able to make that leap. Well, I'll actually mention the Islamic State now. The Islamic State is a little different in this, though, because it's not focused on everyone. It doesn't like the vast majority of groups and peoples around the world. But it is trying to create a state largely out of the territory around Iraq and Syria. Right? Fixed borders don't matter so much to it, but it is locally and regionally defined. Right? And if you go back in the history of the jihadist movement, most of the time in its history, it was not global. It was not focused on the United States. If you look at the movement in the 80s and early 90s, it was much more about local regimes. And the Islamic State is returning to that, right? Where it's returning to an emphasis on the Middle East, an emphasis on trying to govern Muslims, trying to create local facts on the ground. And it's a very different phenomenon than Al-Qaeda. Another issue is that the zealotry of these groups works against them. Now, you need some degree of zealotry because you're trying to convince people to do something that an economist would say is fundamentally irrational, right? So let's even put aside the thousands of people who are becoming suicide bombers, right? But just joining one of these groups and going to Iraq and Syria to fight means you're probably going to die. Right? It's a low probability event, right? And, survival is a relatively low probability, a huge risk. So you want people who are highly committed, who believe the reward will be a spiritual reward or the esteem of those around them. And part of that is you play up the idea that Islam is under attack. And that could be by Israel, it could be by the United States, it could be by Shia Muslims, lots of enemies out there. And you're recruiting in the name of purity, right? And you're trying to convince people that they can walk proud in their neighborhood because people will point to them and say, there's someone who's standing up, right? There's someone who's defending their community, right? So, imagine, and this is a serious analogy, imagine the United States is under attack, right? And how a young man or young woman feels walking down the streets in the uniform of a U.S. Marine, right? Where they feel a sense of pride and people in the community look at them with pride, right? That's the image they're trying to convey is you are a defender of this community. Right? And you are there. To do this in part, though, they have to have a fairly narrow definition of who is a good Muslim. Right? Because if they define it broadly, the vast majority of moderate Muslim leaders hate these guys, right? And condemn them on a regular basis. So they have to be able to say that the moderates, the governments, they're all illegitimate. But when you do that, you start to raise a very difficult question, which is who is a good Muslim? And the bar is always higher. Right? There's never, once you say that some people who most people consider good Muslims are not, you can always say there's, you pray 5 times a day. Really? Is that enough? Maybe you should always be trying to pray in your spare time, right? You are someone who is committed to jihad, but you haven't gone to every fight. You haven't dedicated your life completely. You should do more, right? There's always going to be a level up. And they've largely failed in when they've tried to declare regimes to be non-Islamic. When they've tried to say the Saudis, right, where Saudi leaders might, go to Paris and have huge parties with tons of prostitutes, and they say, these guys aren't good Muslims. Most Saudis say, nah, we don't buy that, right? They are not perfect, but that's quite different than saying that they are apostates, right? That what is in a person's heart is very difficult to judge, right? And when they've gone after police or soldiers, people have said, you're going after ordinary Muslims, right? You're not going after the enemy. And that's problem has gotten even worse because a number of these groups, this happened in Algeria, this happened in Iraq, to a degree early on in Egypt a bit, have gone after ordinary Muslims, not even supporters of the regime. And it was a very strong you're with us or against us argument, right? Which is if you're not joining our group, you're not a good Muslim. If you're not a good Muslim, you are actually an apostate, right? You are someone who is turning his back on Islam, and therefore you should be killed. So you had a number of these groups perpetuate slaughter in their own societies. And so the barbarism we see with the Islamic State today, we saw before in different places. We saw it in Algeria in the 90s. It was god-awful, the same sorts of things. The only difference is no one paid attention, right? Huge, over 100,000 people died, many civilians, villages wiped out. I won't describe the atrocities, but I'll just say comparable to the Islamic State. And people were not paying attention. But it was this idea that the militants had that society itself needed to be cleansed and purged. But this fails, right? So people rallied around the Algerian regime, which is autocratic, kleptocratic, put whatever negative adjective you want in front of it. Yet it's better than the jihadists, right? And so you had a regime that, the civil war in Algeria begins when there's a democratic election. The regime declares null and void and has effectively a military coup, right? Over time, people say, I'll take the military coup over the crazies who are emerging, right? And that's a common pattern. What seems to be different, I'll say, where the group has done well has been when they've been able to emphasize what I'll call nationalism, for lack of a better term, which is that Muslims as a community, right, not just as believers, but as a community of people, are under attack from non-Muslims, right? So that could be Palestinians are being attacked by Israelis. It could be Chechens are being attacked by Russians. It could be especially Iraqis are being attacked by Americans, right? So right after the 9/11 attacks, you had widespread criticism of Al-Qaeda from within the jihadist world. So not mainstream Muslims, right, but within the jihadist world, and they said a couple things. They said, one, this is stupid, right? You just woke up the beast, right, in which, with just kind of a swat of its hand, destroyed the only true Islamic government in the world, the Islamic Emirate of Afghanistan, the Taliban, right? So one, that was really stupid. But two, you guys are always shouting jihad, right? So a Christian beats up a Muslim in the Philippines and you say jihad, right? That's not jihad. Jihad is when, just hypothetically, let's say a Christian power suddenly invades and occupies a Muslim land, right? Then you can do jihad, right? So at a time when Al-Qaeda after 9/11 was discredited within its own people, the Iraq invasion is a savior for its narrative point of view, because they're able to say, you see, we told you what was going on. We told you that the United States was bent on subjugating the Muslim world. And this sort of story, the idea that foreigners are coming to occupy Muslim lands, has been appealing, in part because it has a lot of backing from much more mainstream figures, right? The fighting the Americans in Iraq was something that the vast majority of people in the Arab world supported, right? They said good guys and bad guys, right? And there are state-paid preachers and pro-U.S. allies like Egypt and Saudi Arabia that are preaching, the American presence in Iraq needs to be resisted. Right? What's changed, though, is this shift towards sectarianism, right? Where I just said, the kind of conflict within Islam hasn't been a big seller. When they've been able to pitch it as a conflict between good Muslims and bad Muslims, and especially a defined community, the Shia, that's worked rather well, right? And this is something that emerges out of the Iraq War, where the war becomes more sectarian over time. And those seeds are there and really bloom completely in the Syrian civil war. So today, the narrative is much more about sectarianism. And that's why the Islamic State has done well, because historically Al-Qaeda really tried to downplay sectarianism. Their view was, we have our differences with our Shia brothers, but the American presence is such a big deal, and we should focus first and foremost on that. And later on down the road, we'll get to the Shia, right? And Al-Qaeda cut deals with Iran, for example. It's very pragmatic. The Islamic State said the American presence can wait, right? The Shia are the true enemies. They're the enemy within. And most religions have that seed, right, where the enemy within is where the real hatred is, right? And if you think about it, it's actually somewhat logical, right? Because if, I grew up in a small town in the Midwest, right? And we're large evangelical presence. And if someone, they would say, someone in Saudi Arabia who has not been raised in the teachings of Jesus Christ, if they're not Christian, I get it, right? Our duty would be to preach, to show them the light. But someone who's been to my church, read the Bible, heard our preacher, and then declares himself not a believer, that's a different story, right? That person has no excuse. And almost every religion has that particular hatred for the apostate, right? And it really is showing up today in the world. So that's one issue they have to deal with. Another thing they have to deal with is, I don't really know a kind of scholarly way to say it, but they have to deal with the idiot problem, right? Which is many of their recruits, especially in the West, are functional idiots. Okay? And now part of this might be somewhat of a selection issue, right? Which is you have certain people who are, seem to be volunteering for death, if you will. But historically, that's actually not true. If you look at the Palestinian cause, for example, the suicide bombers in Gaza during the Second Intifada were relatively well educated, were people who had jobs, were people who had a future, but believed the best thing they could do for their community was to attack Israel and to the point of sacrificing their lives, right? They were not losers for the most part, some exceptions. But many of the people in the West, especially the people we'll call lone wolves, don't know what they're doing, right? And so the example I think that illustrates it well to me is the attack on Glasgow Airport, which happened, 7 or 8 years ago. In this, you had two people who were individually very smart, right? One is a doctor, one's an engineer. Okay? And so, if one of you gets sick, you don't want Dr. Dan Byman helping you, right? You want a real doctor, right? And this person could have helped. So no question about their intelligence. However, they were not trained. So what do? First, they are trying to do a car bomb of a nightclub. And so they park the car in front of the nightclub with a lot of propane in it. And they park it in a no parking zone. So, of course, the car is towed, right? And as someone who parked outside a little before the curfew, I'm a little nervous about that. But so the car is towed. At the impound lot, people smell the gas coming out of the car. And so they call in the bomb squad. They left their cell phone in the car. So they revealed the whole network. Realizing what's happening, they panic and decide to do the attack in the airport. And they have their car filled with propane tanks, and they light on fire, and they ram the barriers to get into the airport. And you've seen the movies where you ram the barriers and you get through. Just a little tip, the barriers actually work, right? So they ram the barriers, and the barriers stop the car, right? So they're on fire in front of the airport, right? And, I'm saying this, but we have most of the attacks in the United States, or I should say plots, have been people who are not competent, right? For the longest time, for almost a decade after 9/11, no jihadist had ever built a bomb in the United States after 9/11, right? Now, in the 1970s, we had hundreds of bombings in this country, hundreds. Right? I'm not exaggerating. We had hundreds of bombings, and to the point where no one cared, right? People just didn't pay attention. And so many of them did buy bombs from FBI agents, right? But in terms of actually being able to build a functional bomb, they were incompetent. And it's because they have a hard time training, right? By disrupting the haven, they are not able to get the training. So to say a doctor or an engineer is too stupid to build a bomb is wrong. But you can't say if they're not trained, they're probably going to screw it up the first time. And you only get one time, right? And this is not something that, I built a bomb, it failed the first 5 times, but that's okay, right? You're in big trouble if it fails. And so they have a problem with training, and it's hard for them to get back and forth historically. Now, war is often a form of training, right? It's a very Darwinian form of training, right? Where people go in and many people don't make it out, but those who do make it out, many of them are quite skilled. So being in conflict helps them with that problem. Let me talk a little bit about terrorism. For the most part, terrorism is only a very minor part of what these groups do. Okay, so we call them terrorist groups, and for the most part, to me, that's a very bad label, right? So the closest exception is the Al-Qaeda core, right? So the organization around Ayman al-Zawahiri. And they've used terrorism to kind of grab world attention. They've tried to unify their movement under an anti-U.S. banner through terrorism. And they're hoping to inspire people. They also hope that the United States, part of the logic of 9/11 was to get the United States sucked into Afghanistan, right? To have a Soviet-style experience where the United States reacts in anger and does something, basically moves to Al-Qaeda's home field. But even Al-Qaeda spent most of its budget supporting various insurgent groups, right? It put a lot of money into propaganda, right? So I tend to focus on budgets in terms of what organizations are really about, and most of their budget didn't go to terrorism. And that's just Al-Qaeda, right? So if you start to look at Al-Qaeda affiliates, so Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, Al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb, they're really about civil war, right? And there are different ways to fight civil wars, right? Part of it is you do guerrilla warfare. Part of it is you do urban insurgency. Part of it is if you can grab territory, you build a conventional force and you start to expand the way armies do. The Islamic State is all about civil war, right? It uses tanks, right? It uses massed artillery. It's an organization that fights conventional warfare, right? And it does do insurgency and guerrilla warfare in other parts of areas it controls, but it's a much, militarily, we know what this looks like. It's a much more traditional foe. Terrorism is used in war to kind of reach out beyond the battlefield. It's used to demoralize enemies. It's used to make security forces afraid, right? So the police go home and thus the insurgents get free rein. The Islamic State, somewhat incredibly, actually uses suicide bombing the way other militaries might use, rocket-propelled grenades, right? Where they, deploy a couple suicide bombers at a particular site and then other forces rush it after they've cleared it, right? So they're using it as part of, in a strange way, combined arms. But for the most part, this isn't what we think of when we think about terrorism. And these wars are all consuming, right? So you have the Islamic State doing hundreds of suicide bombings, but not in the United States, not in Europe, right? So when volunteers go over there, and I'll talk a bit later about foreign fighters, most of what they want is cannon fodder, right? Most of what they want are people who will help them prosecute their local war. So I mentioned the Islamic State is somewhat of a blast from the past in the sense of it's a return to a focus on the Middle East, on the immediate enemy rather than the far enemy of the United States. It's a little different because it's actually successful, right? This is an organization that controls a large amount of territory. It governs over a large number of people, and it has resisted militarily efforts of a number of impressive militaries, right? So by the standards of this movement, it's accomplished a lot. It is also successful, as I mentioned, because of sectarianism. And so it's been able to attract funders, and it's been able to attract recruits. And its violence is somewhat of a double-edged sword, but largely positive for it, right? Which is its violence has repelled a lot of people, has caused it a lot of condemnation, but it's very attractive to a very important demographic, which is young males 15 to 25, right, which is a key source of recruits. It also has a brand, right? And people spend a lot of time talking about its theology. Many of the recruits who go there are theologically illiterate, right? I'm not a Muslim, but I believe I know more about Islam than, I don't know if the majority, but certainly many of the recruits. And there was one famous case where a couple people bought Islam for Dummies as they hopped on the plane to Syria, right? But that's not why they're going, right? They're going because they can get the respect of their friends and their community, and in part because this organization has a brand that's, the term I use that I'm deliberately being somewhat, using slang is, it's a badass brand, right? People see them as badass, right? They're the ones who kill in cool ways, the ones who rape, right? And these are rewards, okay? And we have to think of it from a very different mindset, right? Which is, cool, I get to have sex slaves, and cool, I get to be the badass who's going to be wreaking havoc, right? And that, I hope, does not appeal to the vast majority of people, but they don't need to, right? You just need certain demographics to give them enough resources where they'll move forward. So some counterterrorism implications. There's a lot of good news here, right? The biggest one is The intelligence and security effort is a million times better than it was before 9/11. Okay, now the debate in the United States, at least, is it too good, right? Is NSA too active? Is the FBI too active? But before 9/11, there were a relatively small number of people working on these problems, handfuls, right? Now there are thousands, tens of thousands, depending on who you want to count, right? So it's a massive effort, and that ignores the bigger part of the kind of counterterrorism arm, which is the worldwide effort, right? That the United States and its works with its allies around the world. And that sounds kind of like a bland thing, right? We're going to work with our allies, and together we'll solve this problem. But what this means is in every country, there are thousands or tens of thousands of police and intelligence personnel helping out. So if you read the New York Times carefully, you will see, 3 people arrested of suspicion of blank, right? And that's an intelligence success, right? Many of those people would not have been arrested before 9/11 because no one really cared, right? That was just not a priority. Historically, the United States has succeeded by focusing on a relatively small number of skilled personnel, right? I'm a believer in the drone campaign in Pakistan in particular, and in part because it devastated the ranks of the Al-Qaeda leadership, but also went after their logisticians, their guys who could build bombs, their key lieutenants. So it was hard for them to replace their losses, right? This doesn't work for larger groups, right? You need a much greater campaign that you effectively need people on the ground for, right? So what the United States was doing near the end of its time in Iraq in 2006, 2007, that was a much more massive effort, but it was only possible because the United States had forces on the ground, and you can't do that simply with drones, right? So that works for a narrow target set, and perhaps only in Pakistan, frankly, but it, in my view, doesn't work for some of the others. If you want to stop the Islamic State, you need to think about one of its biggest recruiting pitches, which is that it's winning, right? It's an organization, again, I said, it's defying all these people. It's pushing back the Iraqi government. The United States is bombing it without much success. There's a debate on this. And it's able to say to people, we're winners. And that's a tremendously appealing recruiting pitch, right? And so changing that is conceptually very easy, right? In my view, it's actually very easy to defeat the Islamic State, right? I don't think they're particularly good fighters. By comparisons to a NATO quality military, let alone the United States, they're not particularly well armed. They would be devastated in a confrontation with the real military. But no one wants to be that real military, right? There's a question, I don't think the American people have any appetite to put boots back on the ground in the Middle East. I don't think neighbors like Turkey do. And in part because of the next question, which is, okay, so you've beaten the Islamic State. Now what? Right? And the record of recent military interventions has been that now what question is one that people can't really answer, right? What takes over the void? And this is something that would probably require sustained presence. There would be an insurgency you'd have to fight. It would be very messy. And so the question is, would it be in some ways like Afghanistan, where when the United States withdraws, it's going to be a very nasty situation? You can do things to get locals to do more. You can use air power and other standoff means to tip the balance. But you have to expect limited results, right? In Syria, for example, the locals want to fight Bashar al-Assad. Why do they want to fight him instead of the Islamic State? Because he's the one who's killed the vast majority of their friends and family, right? So understandable, but not the U.S. priority. In Iraq, the government is concerned about having a military that's very competent because that military could launch a coup or be used by rival groups. So a lot of our efforts to improve the military go against a strong political goal of the Iraqi government. So when you work through others, you have to accept there are going to be huge, huge problems. I'll stop there but end with one issue, which is I have a particular interest in the foreign fighter threat that I mentioned I'd come back to. This is understandably a huge concern of Western security services, as numbers are inexact, but roughly almost 3,000 have, from the United States, Australia, and especially Europe, have gone to fight. This should be a concern, but it also should not be the we should freak out concern for a couple of reasons. Some of those who go are going to die, right? And there are different historical figures for this, right? In Afghanistan, where there wasn't much fighting of the Arab foreign fighters, roughly 5% probably died. In Chechnya, fighting the Russians, the foreigners probably died about 95%. right? My much more slipshod statistics for Iraq and Syria today put it about 20-25%. But that's a good chunk of people. Some will stay on and just be professional jihadists and never come back. Of those who do come back, many will come back traumatized or having no interest in pursuing the fight. Of those who want to who still believe in the fight, they will believe that they shouldn't attack their home. They should be going off to the next fight where, again, either Sunnis are killing Shia or vice versa, or where Muslim lands are under attack, right? So that's a much more defined problem space than attacking in France or the UK. All that said, there are still going to be some who want to do attacks. But the big difference here is the intelligence services and security services being much better, right? And part of that is they're present in large numbers. They've penetrated or formed links to local communities. And also, one of the advantages of the insurgency is social media, right? They can recruit, they can publicize their cause, but every time a jihadist gets on social media, he is revealing his entire network, right? He is saying who all his friends and followers are, right? I mean, that's the intelligence dream. When I was used to work in government, right, we used to spend years working on that question, right? Now, if I have someone's phone, I know the answer to all that, right? And you discover all these people you didn't know before, right? So there are real benefits and opportunities going on. But the last thing I'll say is there probably will be some attacks. And the one thing we failed at, and here I'll end, is we failed at resilience, right? Which is, if you go back to September 12th, 2001, a lot of people like me said, we're going to be hit again, it's going to be big, look out, long campaign. Hasn't happened, right? Now, some of that was a little luck, right? There are almost a few airplanes that went down where it could have been very different. But for the most part, this threat has not been as great as we thought. Yet, when 3 people die in a bomb blast in Boston, collectively we freak out, right? When Ambassador Stevens is killed by a range of motley jihadists, it is politicized, right? And instead, we lost diplomats, I would say heroic diplomats, in the 80s and the 70s from terrorism, right? And there was an understanding that it's a risky, dangerous world out there, and we want to do business in that world, so some of the people who do public service will take risks. And when they die, we should call them heroes, right? We should honor them. And we as a society have failed in this, right? We are less resilient against terrorism than we were before 9/11, right? So I would say we have many successes, but I'll close with what I feel is a very big failure. And it's frankly our failure, right? It's not just our elected leaders.
So I have a question. There's a lot of criticism of what Obama didn't do in regard to Syria, what might have been done.
Right.
Particularly by politicians who often have a very simple solution and haven't learned anything from the historical past, particularly Iraq, for example. And my question to you is, what do you think that the U.S. could have done that might have been useful in Syria to prevent perhaps all of the migrants leaving for Europe?
I share some of the criticism of the president on Syria, and I for once, I issued it in a timely way, and like most of my analysis was quickly ignored. Let me first of all, though, give you the president's logic, which to me is sensible logic. It's not what I agree with, but I don't think we should be dismissive, which is the United States is very bad at intervening in the Middle East, right? And when we do so, we tend to unite everyone against us. With Syria, there was a big question, which is what next? Obama, many of his officials would say, we intervened in Libya, right? We did the right thing. We got rid of a brutal dictator. Libyan people are like, yay, America, right? And then later on, it's a mess. There's anti-Americanism. So why would we want to get involved in this one again? And beyond that, he's probably going to fall, Bashar al-Assad is probably going to fall of his own weight, right? And that was the assumption of many people at the time. It's not a foolish assumption. It was touch and go for this regime. I believe, however, that there was a good case to be made, and I, among others, made it, which is that he might not fall, right? And it wasn't he won't fall, right? We're talking probabilities here, right? But that there are reasons to think he would survive. But the big one to me is the radicalization of the opposition was predictable. And by the United States not working with the opposition much more aggressively, much more early on, that we lost the chance to more easily influence that opposition. So the opposition was not unified, right? It was supported by dozens of countries, which all had their own faction that fought each other. They were desperate for arms and fighters, so they allowed the jihadists in because if my family's being shot, I don't really care if the guy next to me is a criminal, if he's going to shoot back at people shooting my family, right? So they were desperate for help. And my view is if we had organized, armed the opposition much earlier, we could have had perhaps more influence. Now, a couple things would have happened, right? One is we might have a degree of moral culpability if these guys had failed, right? We send these guys in, they start to get killed. Well, maybe we should give them some air power support. Well, that's only working part way. Maybe we should allow them for ground troops, right? So there's a real question of would we have escalated? And then there's a question of what would these guys have been like had they won, right? Would they have been, everyone has this kind of, straw man of Jeffersonian Democrats, okay? Not Jeffersonian Democrats, but would they have been reasonably competent, reasonably humane people? And I don't know, right? I could say that we had a better chance if we had been involved, but all those are big questions. So I think it would have been a gamble. I think it was a gamble worth taking, but it would have been a gamble. So I think that even in hindsight, the case for intervention is still a tough one, even though I would have been for it.
Do you agree with the assertion that Iran is sponsoring international terrorism? And in this connection, what do you think about the Iranian nuclear deal?
Iran certainly sponsors international terrorism, right? And there's no, to me, ambiguity about it. Now, part of this gets to this question of what is terrorism, right? And I don't mean that in a moral sense, but groups like Hezbollah, where Iran's closest relationship is with Hezbollah. Hezbollah is a political party. It is part of the government of Lebanon. It is a conventional force in parts of Lebanon. It is a counterinsurgency army in Syria. And it has an international terrorism presence, right? It also has hospitals and schools, right? It's kind of all these different things. So Iran supports it, including, especially, I would actually say, Iran works with its militant wing for violence, right? And Iran has done this in Iraq. It does it in Afghanistan. Iran even has links to some of the very nasty Al-Qaeda type jihadists who are somewhat anti-Shia. So there's no question to me Iran is linked to a variety of nasty groups, some of which are pure terrorists and some of which use terrorism. The nuclear deal. I think the nuclear deal is, I'm just to be clear, I'm for the nuclear deal, but I'm largely for it on the grounds that it sets back Iran's nuclear program. In terms of terrorism, it is plausible to me that Iran would take some of the additional funding it has and give it to militant groups. That's, I notionally think, if Iran has an extra $100 and it's spending its budget in certain ways, that if you split that $100 up, some would go to bad guys and some would go to hospitals, right? Iran has huge budget issues, right? And those budget issues are in part because of economic mismanagement of its own economy. But also, as you may have noticed when you filled up your car, the price of oil has plummeted. And this is a petroleum-dependent economy. So Iran has huge budget issues at a time when, now that it has a deal, it's raised popular expectations. Right? This is a huge gamble for the Iranian leaders, much more so than for Obama. And the Iranian people are not, thank goodness, right? We're going to be a normal country. We're going to have economic growth. We're going to have stability. They have a lot of problems that have nothing to do with international sanctions. Right? And so there's going to be a lot of popular disappointment. I think they're actually going to have to put more money into appeasing domestic opinion. But the question is, will they be able to lift all boats, right? Will they be able to take, 80% of what they get, throw it domestically, but still provide 20% more to militant groups? And my guess is yes. I would be surprised if some of the militant groups don't benefit in some way from this. I think, in my view, it's actually a relatively small price to pay. To set back a nuclear program of a country that's relatively hostile is, to me, a huge success. And I'm strongly for that, even though I think it's not a perfect deal in a variety of ways and does have some negative implications, including for terrorism.
You mentioned earlier that it seems like ISIL's main target is, as you mentioned, Shia Islam. Seeing that Iran is made up of Shia Muslims, why aren't we, kind of in accordance with that theory, seeing more terrorist attacks in Iran, seeing, more attacks on even Iranian soil with the organization that close by?
The Islamic State, for the most part, does not do international terrorism, right? It attacks in its region. So it has attacked Shia targets in Lebanon, especially in Iraq, but it's fighting a war and wants to use its assets to help that war. And so it might attack nearby, but attacking in Iran is much harder, right, and would require either some sympathetic locals, and there are some Sunnis in Iran, and maybe some would do it, or it requires them to organize themselves and put a lot of resources into it. So I think it's primarily resource and priority issues. Their view is we can kill Shia, they would call the Alawis, to avoid complexity, but there's the dominant community in Syria is the Alawi community, which has some doctrinal similarities to the Shia. They could say, and from Jihad's point of view, they're all the same. They're all one big apostate group. They'd say, we can kill them here. We could kill them in Iraq. So if I could kill one here, why do I have to walk all the way over there to do it, right? But it's not out of the question, right? And I think that Iranian diplomats in particular are vulnerable, right? And we've seen Iranian diplomats be killed or taken hostage in different parts of the world. So I think that animus is real. And we'll see it like we saw an attack on the Iranian embassy in Lebanon, for example, by Sunni jihadist groups based in Syria. We'll see that sort of thing at the very least.
You spoke a lot about the way that we have a broad definition of what terrorism is, and we kind of use it haphazardly almost.
Right.
Is the onus on the media in our country to really have a more nuanced view and application of the word terror, and is there any likelihood that we'll find it?
I used to blame the media for a lot of this, and I've kind of given up. You get the media you deserve, right? And there are plenty of very serious, thoughtful pieces, and then there's plenty of alarmist claptrap, right? And so, in a way, there isn't such a thing as the media, right? There are thousands, tens of thousands, young people, you know much more than I do, right? There are lots and lots of voices out there of different degrees of seriousness and responsibility. Right, so if you listen to the Lair, I listen to the Lair Hour on the radio. If you watch the Lair Hour, if you read the New York Times, or for that matter, the Wall Street Journal, the Washington Post, you'll see some very in-depth, nuanced analyses of many of these phenomena. And then you can hear the most alarmist things by looking at other sources. I'd like to see more responsibility by our political leaders of both parties, but the political incentive is the opposite direction, right? Which is, again, I point to things like Benghazi and Boston, right? If to me, Obama's 8 years in office, the terrorism problems are Benghazi and Boston, that's a home run, right? Like that's just amazing to me. But people don't see it that way, right? People see these as overwhelming, huge problems. And, with the Islamic State, most Americans, think they've attacked us, right? That they've done international terrorism on U.S. soil. Right, and they also think actually some of their killings of U.S. hostages in the area were why we intervened instead of after we intervened. Right, there is a lot of conflation, and it's in part because to justify intervention, you need to play up a threat, but also politically to criticize, you need to say the problem is bigger. Right, and we expect this all the time on domestic issues. Right, so we expect people to say, the IRS is a criminal organization and we're horribly overtaxed. Right, Obamacare is a disaster and millions of people are dying, or we're not nearly funding Obamacare enough. We should do much more. Right, we expect that sort of exaggeration on domestic issues, and to me, we should just expect it on foreign policy ones. And I would love it if we had more responsible dialogue, but I've just kind of, after years of having that be a standard talking point, I have no idea how to accomplish it. So I've kind of taken it out of my spiel.
Obviously, we're helping out the Kurds with at least some type of advisory role in Iraq. But when it comes to Turkey, we have long-standing agreements to help them with their surveillance, at the very least, with the PKK. And they started taking advantage of that situation and, going on raids against the PKK. At what point do you think we're going to have to establish some type of cooperation with Turkey as far as the Kurds go? Because I feel like that's an issue that will pop up eventually. Right. And just any comments on whatever's going on.
This is a really complex issue, which is Turkey's foreign policy. Turkey, with regard to Syria, Turkey initially very strongly wanted Assad out, much more so than we did. And as a result, it actively backed several opposition groups and also allowed thousands of jihadists to transit Turkish soil to enter Syria. Right, you could kind of show up at the airport or the bus station and be like, "Hey, I'm looking for the fight," and someone would be like, "Okay," and the Turkish police and security services were not interfering. As the Syrian conflict continued, the Kurdish issue started to come to the fore more and more, and this gets very complex because Syria has a Kurdish population, Iran does, Iraq does, and Turkey does, and they all have their own political entities. And Syria likes the Iraqi Kurdish organization and works very closely with it. It does not like its own Kurdish organizations, which it sees as a terrorist group, as a rebel group. The Syrian group is closely allied with the Turkish one. So what Turkey wanted were for Iraqi Kurds to come to Syria to fight, rather than helping Syrian Kurds fight, because he was afraid that those Kurds would be linked up with its own domestic opposition. So, as you know, it gets incredibly complex. And what Turkey has been afraid of is that U.S. efforts to back local forces mean that we're going to back the Kurds, which mean the Kurds are going to get stronger, which mean its own domestic problems are going to get stronger. And again, this is part of the problem when the United States is trying to do this through allies, is they have their own concerns and objectives, right? And these aren't illegitimate, right? I mean, the issue of domestic stability, domestic violence, the Turkish national identity, these are overwhelming issues. You can disagree with Turkish policy, but you can't say, oh, you're being stupid, you should focus on what we care about, right? And I think sometimes we think the Islamic State threat is so manifest, right? When to many people in the region, there are other concerns that are more important. So a major success, I think, of the Obama administration in late July, I believe it was getting have Turkey be part of this coalition. But the next step will be having it be fighting the right people in this. So it's going to be a constant battle.
What do you think is the likelihood that among the refugees there will be ISIS and or other members, people who represent a threat?
Let me divide the refugees into multiple categories. There's the vast majority of refugees are relatively near the conflict zone. So they're in Jordan, they're in Lebanon in particular, Turkey, of course. Those refugees have a high degree of danger of being sucked back into the conflict. They will not be integrated into their host society. They will be fed daily stories of atrocities by one side or the other. And the conflict is reachable for them, right? One of the best comparisons, unfortunately, is the 1949 Palestinian diaspora, where the refugee camps produced a generation of, call what you will, terrorists, militants, whatever word you want to use, and is producing future generations, right? This problem is not going away because you have lots of young men with very few alternatives in a highly politicized environment with conflict going on nearby, right? So it's easy recruiting ground for militant groups. If these camps can be policed, if the communities can be integrated, it's a very different story, right? But they're probably not going to be. Well, policing might happen, but the integration, probably not. The Europe question is a different one. Here you're far from the conflict zone, right? So you don't have that, you just pop in, you pop out, right? In a strange way, one of the bigger dangers are some of the European Muslim radicals radicalizing the Syrian refugees, because you have a real problem, not in terms of overall numbers, but in terms of constant presence of a somewhat radicalized small segment of the European Muslim population that will be going after the refugees in propaganda sense. And again, relatively fertile ground, right? To say you were driven from your home, you were a victim of atrocities, on. So ironically, one of my concerns is to save the Syrian refugees, not that they'll radicalize European Muslims, but the other way around. And inevitably there'll be a few, right? And again, there are probably people coming in who right now desperately just want to take care of their family, right? But their 12-year-old son will soon be a 17-year-old son. And maybe he'll be bored, maybe he'll be, remember atrocity back home, maybe he'll be slighted, maybe he'll just fall in with the wrong crowd, right? So some will be, but I still don't see that as a reason not to do this, right? I think the danger of stopping this is actually much greater beyond, in my view, the moral imperative, right? To me, if the world is not going to do anything about Syria, there is a moral imperative to help the people being slaughtered in staggering numbers. And I think the United States should be part of that, right? I think we have a duty to take more than the pathetic number we're taking.
Please join me in thanking Daniel.
Thank you all.